We are thrilled to have Cameron Tonkinwise as the first speaker of our Spring 2023 series. Cameron has given an annual lecture in this program almost every year of its existence, and we're so lucky that he accepts our invitation every time we reach out. Cameron is one of the top design minds in the world. He's an expert in transition design and the systems level change needed to address our challenges around sustainable and equitable futures. He has hugely impacted the way design is taught at distinguished schools such as Carnegie Mellon, Parsons University of Technology, Sydney. And even though he hasn't been a faculty here at POD, he has had a great influence on our pedagogy and has been a propellant force, continually affirming our mission and approach. And for this, we are truly, truly grateful, Cameron. You read more of his bio elsewhere, but I have a feeling we're in for a treat this afternoon. Cameron always has a new talk for us, and I feel sometimes we're sort of the first to experience some of these new presentations and arguments. I don't know what's coming up. But a quick reminder to please mute your microphones until we get to the Q&A portion of the event, which will follow Cameron's talk. Thank you so much for joining us from Australia today, Cameron, where it is early in the morning. And with appreciation, I'll turn things over to you now. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thanks. Thanks, Alan. And thanks to everybody who's come along today. And yes, as Alan said, these are always, I always abuse the opportunity of the invitation to try and think through some things. These are things I've been thinking about for sort of a while and have only sporadically kind of written about them. And I'm just currently thinking about this primarily. So this has to do with service design, which I will talk about. And yes, it was my understanding that when I was looking at my files, the first time I had an SVA talk in my files was February 2013, which suggests that I've been doing this for 10 years. Skipped out a couple of years. One year there was a big snowstorm, other couple of years messing around trying to get back to Australia. But it really has been an incredible opportunity. And what I've done, unbeknownst to the audience, other than Alan, who might be one of the only common elements in all these tedious talks, is actually sort of try and think through a whole bunch of things, primarily around what I was calling big and little, big and small, which was the title of a Botho Strauss play. But I was trying to think about designers trying to be bigger and then worrying about it, and then trying to get them to be bigger again and then worrying about it. So it was a kind of dialectic of these kind of topics about vision-led designing, proactionary versus precautionary, thinking about the relation between empathy and systems thinking, thinking about issues of sacrifice in design, and all of this had to do with, as Alan's indicated, because I spend most of the time in these talks thinking about the background to transition design. And I only really spoke about transition design the last time I spoke to products of design. As I've indicated, this continuous dialogue is really just between myself, and it doesn't help anybody in the audience. So I'm sorry I always do this recounting of what I've done. At some point, I'll try and write it up. I do want to say, though, I'm going to break with that tradition. I'm going to do something different. But I just wanted to mention very briefly that it's been an odd moment of I told you so. I was not aware when I was sort of talking about proactionary imperatives in Silicon Valley tech bros. I wasn't aware when I was talking about sacrifice a couple of years ago that the kind of scam that is crypto was basically funding the effective altruism movement, which is backed up by apparently ethical innovations around long-termism. And I just want to draw attention to the fact that this is very concerning for lots of different reasons. I think it's very concerning as an ethical discourse because it warrants sacrificing solutions to current problems in the name of potential future beings. It's a worry because it's based in a kind of eugenic racism. It's a worry because it is where most of the wealth generation, if you can call crypto investment scams wealth generation, it's where most of that money has actually been going. I think hopefully you're all aware of the issues around effective altruism and long-termism, but it's just one of those things where you've sort of been worrying about a discourse for a while, and then all of a sudden you realize that you were right to worry about it. So I think the takeaway from all these talks I've been giving to the products of design students is it's very important as a designer, even though you are focused on current problems and concerns, social challenges, the concerns of clients and communities that you work with, it's very important to find time to pay attention to the discourses of capital. It's very important to understand that you are in the Products of Design program, using Alan's rightfully famous phrase, you are in the consequence business, not in the product design business. That's why it's products of design. You think a lot, you are taught to think about the way in which the decisions you make about what to materialize will have consequences and to be responsible for those. But you'll be constrained by the philosophies that design the design briefs that you get. You'll be constrained by the movement of resources that actually pay your ability to do that designing of consequences. So all these talks have been an attempt to say you should really pay attention to try and find time. It's a very depressing activity to make sure that you understand what these self-appointed captains of industry are actually doing. For example, I just think it's very important to point out that invariably when you see this ridiculous image on the right, it's most often been touched up to return the car to the redness that it does not have when it's floating in space because of the nature of light and the reflection. It's closer to this very kind of dirty look here. So I think it's just always important to recognize that these kind of, I really think this is the ultimate in speculative design, meaning a complete waste of time. This kind of deliberate creation of space junk, this kind of trolling of the universe, these are not just irrelevant, they are framing the briefs as they arrive. And that's no more the case right now than what's happened to the social media platform. Twitter, for example, and the fact that some of the self-appointed thinkfluencers make ridiculous claims like this, that in fact, that you still hear people saying that founders don't deserve to be rich because of all the employees creating that value. But the falsity of the claim is increasingly obvious as automation enables founders to grow companies with fewer and fewer employees. These are these moments at which not particularly intelligent people say the quiet part out loud. And it's very important that you pay attention to that as a designer. And understand that Twitter has almost no designers left. It certainly has no safety and accessibility and diversity designers at that organization. That this is an attempt by founders to show that you do not need design in order to create a social commons, or at least in order to profit from a social commons. I'm pretty convinced it's going to fail, but this is just an example of the fact that it's very important to find time as designers to notice these discourses and think about the ways in which you position yourselves in relation to them. So as I said, I'm going to break with that tradition a little bit, and I'm going to speak about something I'm thinking a lot about at the moment, which is service design. I'm going to speak specifically about service design as the design of care work or the work of care. And I just draw attention to the fact that Paul Graham here is identifying that he's never, ever worried about maintenance, repair. He's never had difficulty with a form. He's never actually had to phone a business. So he doesn't mind if a business has no phone number or only has an email form and not an email address. He doesn't worry because he doesn't deal with that issue. All of us have to deal with the details of interacting with governments and agencies and interacting with products that fail and interacting with platforms that don't do what they've been designed to do. And so we need to speak to people, and the people at the other end have been service designed. So it's important to remember that the practice of businesses paying attention to a thing called customer service kind of arrived with an innovation around 1-800 numbers and the capacity for customers to actually call back. So if they were going to call back, somebody was going to have to be trained to answer that call and to help people. So the whole after-sales care industry took off only with this kind of innovation in relation to numbers that would be charged to the company and not to the person making the phone call. And so the whole of service design is about this kind of care work, or what's sometimes called the maintainers. The main point that I want to get across to you today is when you think about that aspect of service design, it's very important that service design becomes something other than what it predominantly is in the world at the moment, which is a very instrumental set of tools. So I'm going to run through some of its history, I'm going to run through some of its tools, and I'm going to try and indicate to you some of the politics involved in service design and show you why service designers need to be taking a lot more responsibility for what it is that they're doing. For example, I think I'll begin by saying service design is the design of work. Service design is the design of people's jobs. It is the design of what people do for most of their waking lives. I don't know if I've ever seen a service design education program that draws attention to the fact that more than a product designer, more than even a product designer in the digital platform sense of the term, service designers are literally designing people's lives, much more than all other types of designers. And I've never seen a service design program draw sufficient attention to that. So I think it's always important. Service design is the design of how people will work, of how they will interact with other people, with their managers and with customers or communities or citizens. Just draw a small note here, just as an aside. This was pointed out to me by Kathi Weeks in her fantastic book on feminism and the problem of work, which was written in 2011. I only just read it recently. If you look at the far right-hand side there, 8 hours, often that 8 hours, people not sure what to call it, for work, for rest, and then for what we will. And Kathi Weeks draws attention to this very beautiful phrase, and says the will there is what you are willing to be, what you are willing to happen, what you are willing to make, you are wanting to create in that space. It's not leisure. It's not 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of leisure. It's 8 hours for what we will. It's a space of autonomy. And I just think it's important to kind of remember that as a union slogan. I think what I want to get across to you also today is that service design is fundamentally about helping strangers help each other, and that's a fundamental aspect of society. So in a funny way, service designers are working on the very grain of our society and communities. Okay, so I'll give you a quick kind of history of service design and nod to where I used to work. And I think Terry's online. I'm excited to see her there, having had the great opportunity to be at Carnegie Mellon University. Prior to my arrival, Dick Buchanan famously kind of pointed to these different orders of design. I think they're better characterized as places of design, as kind of type contexts and different types of designing. But certainly Dick Buchanan was witnessing, partly because of the staff member at that time, Shelley Evanson, he was witnessing the emergence of interaction design with Dan Boryalski and the arrival of service design with Shelley Evanson, and noticed that therefore design was beginning to operate in this new field, what Case Dorst has called the expanded field of design, expanding beyond communications and products, but beyond material design and engaging in those interactions and systems and cultures. And that it was a very different type of design. It required a different type of design thinking, for instance, in Dick Buchanan's formulation in his paper on wicked problems in the early 1990s. Service design really took off in the early 2000s, primarily, let's say, in the UK, with the founding of a number of service design dedicated agencies. Engine in 2000, LiveWork in 2001, Hilary Cottam beginning the RED initiative at the UK Design Council in 2002 for about 5 years. And then the founding of the Service Design Network, the International Service Design Network, with Birgit Mager and Shelley Evanson founding that in 2004. So let's say service design officially begins in the early 2000s, having somewhat been named by a design theorist in the early 1990s. However, it's often recognized that one of the first formal uses of bringing design to the issue of services was Lynn Shostak's paper, work around the early 90s, 1982, and then published and summarized in Harvard Business Review in 84. So the discourse occurs prior to kind of Dick Buchanan's drawing attention to it to the design studies community. This was taken up in the 1990s by other people in the management area, Mary Jo Bittner talking about service blueprints also, and the idea of service scapes, etc. And at this point, I'd just like to pause and say all the most influential developers of the discourse and practice of service design have, let's say, something in common. Lynn Shostak, Mary Jo Bittner, Gillian Crampton-Smith, founder of the Ivrea Interaction Institute, Hilary Cottemu, I've mentioned, Birgit Marga at the Cologne International School of Design, Shelley at CMU, and then Facebook, and then Fjord. I think it's very important to just recognize that service design is a discipline of practice of design that has been designed primarily by non-cis males. And this continues in our period now. Sarah Drummond, who's just stepped down from Snook, Lou Down, doing incredible work at government and doing this kind of book here, Lucy Kimball, Lara Pennon, Daniela Sangiorgi, Yoko Okama, running the Service Design Conference in 2020 and really bringing cultural difference to what had been a very Eurocentric discourse and issues of decolonization. This is a discourse which is being led primarily by women and diverse genders other than people like me. And obviously, I don't want to make too much of an essentialist claim here, but this has to do with the fact that these are people who are attending to what has been underrepresented in design because it's underrepresented in capitalism, which is the care economy. And just drawing attention to the work which is really informing a lot of what I talk about today, which is the late, great Dave Graeber's thinking about care work, about debt, about the very many different ways in which society can be organized. So as I said, service design is primarily about thinking through this type of care work, which is interesting because it means that you begin to think caring, why do we care? Who do we care about? And care is an action, it's not an intent, it's not an affect, it's an actual execution and materialization of looking after each other. We care generally what you do for lovers, friends, family, community. It is something that happens. To be in a community is to care for the members of the community. To be in a family is to care for the members of the family, though some of us sometimes have entities in that family that are not caring or that we don't want to have to care about. But these are situations in which the definition of being in that type of community is to enact what is called by Marshall Sahlins generalized reciprocity. You just do what needs to be done, or what Dave Graeber will call fundamental communism, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. So just what are the needs? What is it? You need something, I'm going to do it for you without thinking about reciprocity at all. Now, I think this is important because it allows you to think that designers are people who step in when that essential version of enacted care is not there for some reason. So I've used a ridiculous example here, which is a hugging chair. I'm nodding here to the work by Elaine Scarry, which argues that all artifact creation is an attempt to materialize the care of one person for another when that person can't be there. So if you are in pain and need weight relief, I make you a chair so that I can relieve your weight even when I'm not there. So design is a kind of a supplement. It is a prosthesis that steps in to take care when care is not there to be given. And I use that word gift in the very anthropological sense. Now, this raises a bit of a problem, which is if I am designing services, which I've defined as care work, how do I get people to care for those who are not their lovers, friends, family, and community? And I've said for a long time now, I think the best definition of service design is that it is a rent-a-friend business. I've got a picture here of a very bad early 2000s Dutch comedy. It's bad because it's Dutch. I'm not sure they're masters of the comedic arts. apologies to anyone of Dutch heritage. You do have the Dutch East India Company in your past. So I think all service design is a way of paying somebody to show the care for you that you would expect of a friend. So if I go to a retail store and I'm looking for a pair of jeans, I'm asking the person to help me buy a pair of jeans who is just working in the store, but I'm asking them not just to help me and provide a service, but to actually care for me. I am asking a doctor to care for me. I am asking a cleaner to care for me. I am designing a system in which people can care for those they don't care about, which is the fundamental politics of service design. I'm going to run back now to the history of service design and just draw attention to the fact that I think it's always important to ask that when there's a new X design like service design, it's important to ask, and the questions I'm asking now about sort of caring and design as stepping in when care's not there, it's always important to ask, why is X designable now? Why only now? Why has it just fallen under the attention of design? What did people do before there was X design? What did people do before there was service design? Just to run through some example of the different X's, human-computer interaction happened for a while before there was user-centered design. And I think that should always be terrifying. Like, what were they doing before there was user-centered design? So the X design forces you to ask the question, why are users all of a sudden designable? Why am I able to think about that as the centering of design? What was business before it was customer-centered? Right now, many of us in educational institutions have to deal with the fact that education has become another version of learning-centered design. It's become another UX department as people try to help us with our slides on various platforms for hybrid teaching. So it's important to ask politically, what was education before instructional design, for example? So one can ask this same question. Why did Lynn Shostak begin to think that services were designable? And part of the answer, I think, is important to remember just the timing in which this happened. Lynn Shostak was writing this in the early to mid-80s. Margaret Thatcher gets into power in 1979. Ronald Reagan gets into power in 1981. By 1984, their various neoliberal policies around free markets, privatization, and the withdrawal of the welfare state were well underway. Services become designable as the state stops caring, as the state is stopped from caring, under a policy that says you should all just work out exchange relations of care yourselves. For example, one of the primary models that Shostak uses to explain service blueprinting, the core tool of service design, was this blueprint for a corner shoe shine. Yoko Kama caused me pause to think, why did Lynn Shostak choose this example? Pragmatically, Lynn Shostak chose it because it's a simple example, perhaps. One could worry about the racial politics implied about thinking that a person who is clearly an expert of their domain might need somebody who's not an expert to use visual planning in order to make it a more efficient and profitable business. It was not necessary to design shoe shine unless one wanted to appropriate that business, unless one wanted to think that the people who did it were not sufficiently skilled in doing it. So this is where service design begins. It begins at this kind of moment of kind of racial politics in what seems to be possibly an innocent choice of a case study. Blueprinting, which I'm going to speak about now, is specifically the activity by which service designers use visual planning to see a whole system at once in order to identify possible efficiencies, to see possible failures, and to prototype the system by imagining it rolling it out on a piece of paper in order to then improve it. So when people thought about designing services in 1984, this meant bringing visual planning, blueprinting, to the service system, which does not sound that controversial. However, I think it's important to think about the word. It didn't have to be called a blueprint. It could have been called a visual plan. It could have been called a canvas, though that was a word that really only arrived in the 2010s. A blueprint is literally, in its original formulation when it was blue, a specification document. It tells construction workers exactly what to do. It takes away their autonomy and in detail tells them how to affix one thing to another. A blueprint might be in a later phase customer-centered, but it is primarily a management tool. It is the tool that a manager has to discipline a worker to make sure that they are doing what's in their box and then handing it over in a timely fashion. So service design, even though it begins as an attending to care work, under neoliberalism immediately becomes a kind of management tool. And this is the first kind of lesson for service designers. Whenever you design a service, you are designing a script by which a manager will discipline workers unless you design it differently. The other kind of metaphors that are kicking around in this early formulation are that it scripts, it has a bunch of roles, and it uses the deliberately theatrical metaphor of a front stage and a backstage. This is part of what was also going on in the neoliberal late 80s, early 90s, most significantly articulated by Pine and Gilmore in terms of what they called the experience economy, the fact that wealth generation, what they've called competitive position, requires increasing customization by moving to higher profit margin areas, by shifting from commodities to goods to services to staging experiences. And I draw attention to that word, staging an experience, because obviously what is going on with this shoe shine is that you are appropriating the skill of the worker and getting the customer to attribute it to the service. So this is a situation in which the service appears skilled rather than the service worker. The service worker is merely a box within the overall blueprint, in which case that person only needs to appear skilled. It is a theatrical metaphor, which is why in the early 2000s, Pine and Gilmore suddenly realized there was a problem with the experience economy, which is that it lacked authenticity. The other key aspect of this theatrical metaphor is this line of visibility, which hides the labor actually being done. The point of service design is to make a service look magical. You literally black box by concealing as much as you possibly can. So you have somebody who has what's called aesthetic labor. They're hired for how they look and how they interact. They interact with the customer, and magically the service appears because you have got this efficient process management system hidden, literally behind a line of visibility. So this is the fundamental metaphor of service design that was created by Shostak in '84 and perpetuated right until today. When people go to General Assembly to learn how to do service design, they are taught how to do service blueprinting, and they're using this process of concealing labor. This is the fundamental design process. So just some quick halfway through pausing tips. If you are a service designer and you are using a blueprint, these are my, I could explain them all in detail at some other point, but these are my quick recommendations. There are always more columns before and after a service blueprint. Service blueprint at least has a customer journey and tends to recognize that it's longer than the service encounter. Somebody needs to get to the service encounter and somebody leaves the service encounter. What's invariably not there are all the columns of the worker. The worker has to leave home, get ready, do the transport, get to work, put on the uniform, get into the mindset. Right? So invariably there are always more columns, so add columns. Secondly, the entry and exit points. The whole point about visually planning it is not to have one customer journey, but to allow multiple entry points and to focus on what I would call design endings. And I'll just mention McLeod's excellent book on ways of designing the end of a product's life, the end of a service engagement, drawing on issues of mourning, and death, interestingly, as a way of thinking through how do I exit a particular service. The column should never be of uniform size because the width is a visualization of time. If your service blueprint looks like this, it is a disaster. You are doing patterning in an aesthetic form. No service is this regular. No service has this kind of structure. This is bad visual communication design for really understanding the granularity of the experience of a service. So make sure that the columns are a different width. There should be more layers circling back. The line of visibility should not be straight. The line of visibility should occasionally be perforated. The line of visibility should dip down. There are internal lines of visibility. What can the service workers see? What can the people backstage see? And crucially, always recognize that a service design blueprint, as identified by Andy Pillane and colleagues in their book, is an org chart turned 90 degrees. So the key thing about a service design is not the flow left to right, but the interactions between those departments within the service provider. So those are not just simple boxes that you can just draw lines between. Those are moments at which one department is fighting with another. Okay, so just some quick tips there on how to do service blueprinting. So phase 2 of what I would call the development of service design, again, well referenced by Pine and Gilmore. This was actually work they did prior to the experience economy work, was the dream, and you saw it still in Paul Graham's appalling tweet at the beginning of the talk, is still the dream of automated individuation, of a company being able to provide customized provision to every customer, which means that the main variable in a service design is not the workers, but the customers. So phase 2 is customer-centered service design, which rapidly becomes human-centered, remembering that the human of human-centered is normally in a North Atlantic country. It is a middle-class consumer. It is somebody engaged actually in shopping. So human-centered design invariably means the difficulty somebody has buying something. And as a result, the second tool that is appropriated by service design, taken from interaction design from the work of Alan Cooper at the moment of user-centered human-computer interaction design, is the persona. The idea of you need to do research. Service design is about research. It's design thinking style research. Just by the way, just two important books here. The one on the left is more well-known, a kind of collectively authored book, At the Birth of Service Design, 2010. The one on the right by an Australian local service design company called Huddle, which I just think really captures the essence of what service design in this phase is trying to attend to. So service design is about being human-centered and paying attention to people. The way that manifests for the worker in ways that I think service designers are insufficiently aware of has been pointed out a long time prior by Ari Hochschild in terms of the managed heart, in terms of emotional labor. Emotional labor means many things. It's picked up by feminist politics. It's used a lot these days in a more general term. People are concerned about its washing down, it's being watered down. I would tend to define emotional labor as these three distinct activities. The one is the capacity to control your own emotions as a service worker, which is well portrayed by the television program, the Apple television program, Severance. It is necessary to sever your private life from your work life. You need to learn to control your emotions. You need to become a different sort of person. So you have a work personality, and you have to pack all your private life into a bag and leave it in the locker as you begin your working life. So one part of emotional labor is just containing your own emotions. The second, which is what Hochschild mainly focuses on, is the performing of prescribed emotions, which he characterizes as management worrying about the difference between surface acting and deep acting. Do you really mean it when you say, have a nice day? Do you really mean the smile that's on your face as you walk down the aisles of an aeroplane? The case study, Hochschild is a sociologist, and these are case studies of airline stewardesses on the one hand and payday loan shark getting their money back on the other. And in both cases, these people have to control their own emotions. They have to put on a friendly smile. And then the last and really skilled labor aspect of emotional labor, though it all requires a lot of skill and effort, is controlling customers' emotions, or what these days gets called emotional intelligence, the capacity to read other people's emotions and then influence them. So if service design is about customers and people, unfortunately, because human-centered design is customer-centered and not worker-centered, most of service design pays very little attention to the service worker doing all this emotional labor, pays very little attention to how painful it is to actually do this work, how effortful it is. I suppose the question is, can designers help in this way? And I'm going to sort of keep coming back to the solution, which to some extent is designing the customer themselves. So part of the answer here is you help the worker by designing the customer, which is a really interesting design problem because you don't have as much control of the customer as you do through the proxy of management of the service worker. I should just mention, I skipped over, unfortunately, emotional labor, I think has a lineage which we are still all suffering, which is you need to present a particular self to the work. You can't just turn up as yourself at work. On the other hand, you are encouraged post-neoliberalism to bring your whole self to work. Your organization is in fact your family, your second family, if not your primary family and your actual family, or your secondary family. So you will get your emotional satisfiers at work, which is why you need to become work-centered, which is why the book on the top right comes out of the most popular course at Stanford, which is applying design thinking to personal psychology and career management. So I think it's important just to recognize that this kind of emotional labor within service design has become a generalized requirement of what it means to be a creative class worker anywhere in the world at the moment. The fact that you actually need to design, think your own personality in order to become employable, in order to become valuable. So I think design needs to make an intervention into this, and I'll come back to this after talking about this kind of third phase in service design history. The third phase in service design history is, I think, to some extent, the meshing together of UX and service design. There's always been a fight as to whether service design is a subset of UX or UX is a subset of service design. The two communities, the service designers and the IXD, have not got on for a long time. This used to be the entire of design Twitter, but now that Twitter is just a cesspool, you don't have to step into that mess anymore. I think it's most productively being described by Sarah Drummond as full stack service design, again, using a kind of tech platform coding driven version of value creation, which is odd. I wouldn't have chosen that word. But the idea here is that the service can best be customized and customer-centered when the service worker is in fact everything under the sea level and primarily making use of data-driven understanding the specificity of the customer's requirements and context. So I'll give you a kind of an interesting sort of dangerous version of this. In Australia and New Zealand and the UK, so in these kind of Commonwealth countries, one of the primary ethical requirements of service designing a government service is only tell me once, which has a very important ethic in it, which is if you've suffered trauma and therefore are on hard times and need government service assistance, the worst thing is to be handed from bureaucrat to bureaucrat and having to tell your story over and over again. The way only tell me once works, so it's a very human-centered, ethical-driven principle. The way it works is by ensuring that the frontline service worker who first takes your story gets all the details in as painless a way as possible and puts them in a database, which is then subject to hacking, possibly subject to some form of surveillance, some form of profiteering. You can see here that the very ethic to avoid what's sometimes called trauma-informed service design is playing the same game in a full stack as surveillance capitalism, for example. It's playing this in this same infrastructural attitude. So I worry about this particular framing in terms of full stack because it normalizes this kind of surveillance. I think a better way to think about it, though I'm still a little concerned about it, actually comes out of a lot of the Nordic countries. I was told by a colleague in Sweden, I think, that often the Scandinavian phrasing for what in the West gets called digital, in the Anglosphere gets called digital transformation, is called in Nordic countries self-service design, which is a very clever little twist, that if I'm going to design digital services, I'm designing services that you can use yourself as a citizen. So it's here, I just picked a grab off a website of a Nordic government service design company. And as you can see here, in line with the digitalization of Nordic welfare states, the number of digital self-service solutions for citizens is increasing. In which case the customization is customer-driven, not customer-centered. However, it will still rely on this kind of surveillance capitalism system. Now, I just want to pause and just say, if in the lineage of service design, you've worked from frontline service workers doing shoe shine to frontline service workers smiling and saying, have a nice day, and doing emotional labor, when you arrive at this UX moment of service design, you are ramping up the expectations of in-person service design according to the customizability and self-service ability that people are beginning to experience with digital services. So one of the legacies of this mashup is that people are beginning to demand of people the same level of customization they've come to get from digital platforms. Or to put it the other way around, they treat people with the same contempt they treat chatbots. So they're spending their time, service designers having designed conversational user interfaces, they've designed these interactions with particular systems, and they have created service expectations which are carried over into person-based systems. And the service management literature identifies this consequence, because you're all products of designers, so you're aware of being in the consequence business. The consequence is what's called role stress. Role stress is recognized in management as the moment at which a service worker feels conflicted between the requirements of the job and what is good for the company, meaning good for profit, good for shareholders, and the requirements of being a decent human being. So we all know role stress from the moment at which you've ever been fighting with a system, you're on the phone to a large telco, and you've been wrongly billed, and you're talking to somebody, and it's very clear that that person is following a script, and you try to get them to go off script, and you appeal to them as a person. You say, come on, can't you give me a break? Give me, individual, an exception. You act as an individual. I'm in a relationship with you. This is the point I'm trying to get to. Services are relationships. I'm in a relationship with you. Can't you cut me a break right now? And at that point, the service worker will feel this tension, will feel literally the tension of capitalism, the tension between servicing a system and servicing a person. But they will actually feel the difference between a relation, a value relation, and a relationship. Again, the way to deal with this is to begin to design the customer themselves. Service design seems to finally be getting there with this last phase, which is, I won't spend any time talking about this, but the arrival of this weird discourse called service dominant logic, recognizing that services are very different from product, retail, manufacturing versions of business value creation. The emphasis is on what is called often in service design, the co-creation of value. The co-creation of value is a system in which there is a mutual obligation, though it often gets characterized as facilitation. You can see it here in this table. The firm, customers are targets versus customers as resources, customers are isolated, customers are in a network. None of that on the right-hand side appears to indicate anything about obligations in that way. So this is the work of Vargo and Lush. It comes from a very systems thinking. It means thinking about a service as an ecosystem in which the customer is as much a contributor as the service worker, and they form a system, a socio-technical system of creating value. So the question for designers is, how do you enable co-creation to be a type of relationship? And I've deliberately chosen this weird, I don't know how many people have come across this weird genre. If you do a Google image search of the provision of generic icons to use in your PowerPoint or Canva presentations. The whole of the world is skipping communication design and just using these kind of probably bot-created versions of communication icons. So I'm using this to deliberately signal the difference between actually thinking about a relationship and actually just doing something commoditized. So how does one create relationships? So this is the moment at which we return in conclusion to the work of Dave Graeber. So the reason I'm talking to you about this is that I'm writing a chapter at the moment that tries to explain what Dave Graeber teaches us about service design, which would cause Dave Graeber to roll in his untimely and premature grave. But I do think we have a great opportunity as designers to actually begin learning from this anthropological history of obligations between people. Chapter 5 in Debt is a moment at which Graeber steps back and says, look, I need a fundamental understanding of why people ever do anything for other people, and comes up with these three versions of these obligations: communism, hierarchy, and exchange. Alan Fiske, it's been pointed out, a sociologist, had a very similar related set of structures, which he called sharing, hierarchy, and then he had two versions under exchange. One was equality and one was price. Communism, as I said at the beginning, is with no attention to ever getting anything back, other than a generalized idea that if I do something for you, at some point I'll need something, you'll do something for me. So communism is how we actually live in our families or share households, hopefully, if you haven't used some neoliberal app for bill splitting. Communism is the way in which we get on with each other without it needing to be designed. Hierarchy is when we give to people, again, with no view to reciprocity. We give because we think they're in a position of authority, which is merely a tradition. This is what every good leftist would always tell you. If you want to refuse authority, just refuse authority. It depends on consent. You can always withdraw consent. So all forms of protest are just a way of refusing authority. Authority is just a tradition because people have given taxes to the government, will give taxes to the government because people have given this exorbitant fee to this multinational oligopoly. We'll keep giving this exorbitant fee to this multinational oligopoly. Hierarchy is a traditional form of giving. We exist primarily in economies of exchange. In anthropological societies, these are normally equal exchange. So if I give you something, you need to give me something of equal back at one time. And the whole point is to try and end the interaction. So I have you over to dinner, and then you have me over to dinner. Now we're quits. We don't have to have dinner anymore. It was an equivalence. Most of what we do is what Fisk calls market pricing, which is where we break what is given back into parts. I won't give you the whole meal. I'll just give you this bottle of wine, and then later I'll give you some flowers, and then I might actually go and mow your lawn. In parts, I will pay back, and it allows the exchange to continue. So in anthropological gift societies, I give to you and you give to me. Dave Graeber tells hilarious stories of British colonialists being in Aotearoa, for example, and meeting with Maori and saying, that's a really lovely pendant you have on, at which point the response was, you must have it, you must have it, here you are, I've given you this. And the British were like, wow, that's great, thank you. And then later there'd be a knock on the door and some representatives of the local peoples would arrive and say, we'd like your gun now, please. In exchange, we gave you a gift, you should give us a gift. Took a long time for the British to realize that what they actually needed to do was preemptorily give a gift in order to reverse the obligation on equality to annihilate the relation. Now, I run through this because service design is about using these anthropological insights to enable relationships. It means trying to design gift giving into service interactions, generalized and balanced reciprocity, as Marshall Sahlins calls it, not negative reciprocity, which is a kind of competitive gift giving, or a type of gifting in which I enslave people, or a type of situation in which I give them something they cannot possibly repay. So it's a matter of gifting, which again will contravene most business models, but will create a relationship in which customers will begin to act, can be helped to act in a more friendly manner to reduce emotional labor role stress. It means using the insights of Eleanor Ostrom into commons about creating conventions. It's fine to have rules. Service designers can design rules for customers as long as they don't arrive as rules. Think of the kind of house rules that are a small agreement within Airbnb, which is an appalling example, but nevertheless a moment at which a particular anthropological insight has helped co-creation of value and reduction of bad acting. You need to create customs. Thinking customer always comes from custom. It is about a repeat interaction that allows learning the rules of the interaction. You need a graduated system. You need systems that are time. You need repeat visits. You cannot do service design of one-off visits because that will allow bad actors to betray the commons and to cause role stress and emotional labor. You cannot succeed in this. Design is not the answer. Design can contribute to the creation of sociality, the restoring of sociality in a society quite different from the one that I think Paul Graham is wanting us to head in. Long talk lot there, all concepts, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cameron.